Everyone at that table laughed when my own son told me I could wait outside. Then a waiter walked over and set a bill for $4,300 down at my place, like it was already decided who was paying. I looked at my son, I looked at that folder, then I slid it back across the white tablecloth without saying a single word, and I stood up and walked out. Nobody sitting at that table that night knew whose money had actually built the restaurant they were eating in. Before I get into what happened, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I always like knowing who's listening. Alright, let's get into it. My name is Carl Jennings. I'm 61 years old. I've been a contractor my whole life, the kind of guy who fixes roofs and pours foundations and comes home smelling like sawdust and sweat. I raised my son Ryan mostly on my own after his mother left when he was 9. I'm not a rich man by the way I dress or the truck I drive, but I built more than most people around me ever knew. And the night I'm about to tell you about is where all of it finally came apart, right there in front of a room full of strangers in nice clothes. Denise left in the spring, back when Ryan was 9 years old. There wasn't anything dramatic about it. She just decided she wanted a different life than the one we had in our little rancher on Birch Hollow Road out in Bethel Park, south of Pittsburgh. One day her side of the closet was empty, and her car wasn't in the driveway anymore. I didn't chase her down. I had a boy who needed his lunch packed and his cleats tied, and somebody sitting in a folding chair at every one of his little league games. So that's what I did. I worked construction from sunup until the light gave out, and then I came home and made sure Ryan had clean clothes for school, and a father who showed up to every parent-teacher conference, even the ones where all the teacher wanted to talk about was how much he liked to run his mouth in class. Money was never easy in that house. I stretched a single paycheck across 3 weeks more than once. I ate the same box of spaghetti 4 nights running so Ryan could have the good cereal instead of the store brand. I never told him any of that. I wanted him thinking things were fine, because that's what a father does when he can manage it. He grew up watching me leave the house in steel-toed boots covered in drywall dust, and somewhere in there, without me catching it happening, he started feeling a little embarrassed by that. Kids don't always know how to tell the difference between a hard life and a small life. Ryan mixed the two up early, and I didn't catch how deep it had settled in him until it was already too late to just talk him out of it. By high school, he'd quit inviting friends over. He said our place was too small. I think it was really about the truck parked out front with Jennings Contracting painted on the door and the ladder rack bolted to the roof. I figured it was a phase. I was wrong, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for almost 17 more years. Ryan found his real passion in a kitchen, and it happened almost by accident. He picked up a summer job washing dishes at a diner near the house when he was 17, just to have some spending money, and within a month he was begging the line cook to let him near the grill. He'd come home talking about knife work and sauce reductions the way other boys talked about video games. I remember standing in our kitchen one night, watching him try to build a béarnaise out of a library book, breaking it twice and starting right back over without a word of complaint. I thought to myself, this is it, this is the thing that lights him up, and I told him I'd back him no matter what it cost me. He was right about the passion. I just didn't know yet what backing him would actually mean. He went off to the Ashford School of Culinary Arts up in New York State, and I covered whatever his scholarships didn't touch. I picked up extra weekend jobs, small remodels, deck repairs, anything that paid in cash, and I never let him see how much it strained me. When he came home with his certificate, he had a head full of plans and no interest in working his way up in somebody else's kitchen for 10 years the way everybody told him he should. He wanted to open his own place. He was 28. He had no credit history worth mentioning, and every bank in Pittsburgh turned him down flat when he tried to get a business loan on his own name. That's when he came to me one night at the kitchen table, nervous in a way I hadn't seen out of him since he was small, and told me he needed somebody with a paid-off house and decent credit to put their name behind him. There was only one person in his life who fit that description. I didn't hesitate. I'd spent my whole working life building things with my 2 hands, and here was a chance to help him build something with his. I told him yes before he even got to the end of what he was asking, and I meant every bit of it. I had no idea that yes would end up costing me a great deal more than money. I remortgaged the house on Birch Hollow Road, the same house I'd paid off free and clear 8 years earlier after 2 decades of steady work, and I signed a personal guarantee on a business loan for $1.8 million, a number that still tightens something in my chest every time I say it out loud. The bank wanted more than just a signature backing that kind of money. They wanted real ownership tied to the guarantee, something with teeth in it. So my lawyer set up an LLC, Anvil and Oak Holdings, where I held 35% quiet and on paper only, while Ryan held the rest and ran the place day to day. Ryan asked me for one more thing that night, and looking back, I think that request told me everything I needed to know, if I'd been willing to actually hear it at the time. He asked if we could keep my ownership share quiet, out of the public story. He said investors and customers liked a founder narrative, a young guy who built something out of nothing on grit and talent alone. And having his contractor father listed as a 35% owner would complicate that story. He wanted people believing he'd done every bit of it himself. I told myself it was just branding, the kind of thing young business owners think about, and I agreed to stay quiet about it. The restaurant was called Anvil and Oak, and it opened on a corner lot in Lawrenceville, in a building with exposed brick and old iron fixtures that Ryan had designed to look like something salvaged from the steel mills that used to run that whole stretch of river. I stood in the back of the room on opening night in the one good sport coat I owned, and I watched my son shake hands with reviewers and local business people like he'd been born into that world. Nobody there introduced me as anything more than a family friend who'd come out to support him. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself watching him succeed was payment enough. And for a good while I actually believed that. I didn't understand yet how much a lie like that grows once you let it live in a room long enough without correcting it. Anvil and Oak took off faster than either of us expected. Within 4 years, Ryan had opened 2 more locations, one downtown and one out in Shadyside, and Food magazine started writing him up as one of Pittsburgh's rising culinary names, the self-made kid who'd built something out of a single corner lot on nothing but talent and nerve. Every article told some version of that same story, and every time I read one, I noticed my name wasn't anywhere in it. Not even a line about a father who'd remortgaged his house to make the whole thing possible. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine back then. It was around that time Ryan met Elise Kavanagh at a fundraiser one of his restaurants had catered. The Kavanaghs were old Pittsburgh money, the kind of family with their name on a wing of the local heritage museum and a place up near the lake that had been in the family since the 50s. Gordon Kavanagh, Elise's father, had built a real estate empire that made my slice of one restaurant look like pocket change, and he was the sort of man who valued self-reliance and legacy above nearly everything else. Ryan fell into that world easy, like it had always fit him. When Ryan and Elise married the following year at a vineyard estate outside Lancaster, I sat at a table near the back with a couple of Ryan's old culinary school friends, and I watched him introduce me to Gordon Kavanagh simply as an old family friend who'd helped him out early on. Not his father, just a friend. I remember shaking Gordon's hand, smiling, telling him it was a beautiful ceremony, while something in my chest quietly cracked in a place I didn't have words for at the time. I told myself Ryan had his reasons, that maybe it would settle once the wedding excitement wore off. It never did. It only got worse from there, and I let it, because I still believed being needed quietly beat not being needed at all. 5 years went by that way, me showing up to birthdays and holidays as a background figure Ryan barely acknowledged in front of the Kavanaghs, telling myself every single time that it was fine. Then that spring, Ryan called and invited me to a dinner celebrating Gordon Kavanagh's 65th birthday, being held at the flagship Anvil and Oak location downtown. He told me it mattered to him that I be there, and for the first time in years I let myself feel a small flicker of hope that maybe this time he'd finally introduce me the right way. I'd been out on a job all that week, patching a roof for a family up near Erie whose place had taken storm damage, and I didn't have time to drive home and change before heading in. I showed up in my work jacket and boots, dust still ground into my jeans, because I figured an invitation from my son meant more than clothes ever could. I drove 3 hours straight down from that job site, tired and hungry and genuinely glad at the thought of seeing my son and the grandkids I barely got time with anymore. Walking up to the entrance of Anvil and Oak downtown, the place I'd helped build with my signature and my house as collateral, I felt something between pride and nerves, the same feeling I used to get walking Ryan into his first day of school. Through the big front windows I could see the private dining room in back, white flowers, candlelight, the whole Kavanagh family gathered around a long table in expensive clothes, laughing about something, champagne catching the light. I straightened my jacket the best I could, took a breath, and walked through the front door toward my son and whatever was waiting for me. The hostess recognized me right away and waved me back without even checking a list. I'd been in that restaurant enough times over the years that most of the staff knew my face. Stepping into that private room felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Soft candlelight and expensive perfume, the Kavanaghs dressed like they'd stepped straight out of a magazine. Gordon at the head of the table laughing at something his son-in-law had just said. Ryan spotted me first. I watched the smile he'd been wearing for his in-laws slide sideways into something tighter and more careful. He stood up fast, nearly knocking his chair over, and crossed the room toward me before I'd made it halfway to the table. He asked, low and quick, what I thought I was doing showing up like that. I told him I'd come straight from a job site, that I hadn't had time to change, and that I was sorry if my clothes weren't right for the room. He glanced back over his shoulder, and I watched Elisa's mother lean toward another woman and say something behind her hand, both of them looking our way. Gordon Kavanagh was watching too, his face unreadable in that particular way rich men get when they're deciding whether something is even worth their attention. I could see Ryan doing some kind of math behind his eyes, weighing his father against the family he'd married into, and I could see exactly which side of that scale he was landing on before he ever opened his mouth again. The warmth I'd carried in from Erie, the small hope I'd been holding on to the whole drive down, started draining out of me right there in that doorway. 3 hours of driving suddenly sitting heavy in my legs. Then he said it, loud enough to carry clean across that private room, that this table was for family, and that I could wait outside. For a second I just stood there, not fully taking it in, even though I'd heard every word clean as day. This table is for family, like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the street looking for a free meal. Like 29 years of raising him mostly alone counted for nothing next to how I looked standing in a doorway in work boots. Somebody at that table laughed first, a short surprise sound that broke the quiet, and then it spread, 2 or 3 more voices joining in, not cruel exactly. More the careless kind of laughing people do when they think a joke's been made at somebody else's expense, and they don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. Gordon Kavanagh didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either, just watched with that same unreadable face, comfortable enough in his own skin to let the moment play out without stepping in. I looked past my son at that long table full of candles and champagne, at Elise not quite meeting my eyes, at grandkids I loved more than almost anything in this world, sitting there confused about why Grandpa wasn't taking a seat. Not one person at that table knew that the walls around them, the iron fixtures hanging from the ceiling, the kitchen turning out plates behind that door, existed because I'd signed my name and my house over to a bank 8 years earlier. Nobody knew because Ryan had made very sure of that from the very start. Standing there, I felt something shift in me, quiet and cold and completely clear. Not anger exactly, more like finally seeing something plain for what it actually was. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice or make a scene, because that's not who I am and it never has been. I just nodded once, slow, and started to turn toward the door, telling myself I'd wait it out in the truck, or just drive home and let the whole thing go the way I'd let so many things go over the years. That's when Nico, the head waiter who'd worked at Anvil and Oak since the very first location opened, and who'd seen me at more of these family gatherings than Ryan probably remembered, came around the corner carrying a small leather folder, out of pure habit, the kind built up over years of watching me quietly settle the check, whenever Ryan got too busy running the kitchen to notice. Nico walked straight past my son and set that folder down at the one open seat near where I'd been standing. He never even looked up, just said the total came to $4,300. Whenever I was ready, Mr. Jennings, and turned back toward the kitchen, completely unaware of what had happened 30 seconds earlier in that room. I looked down at that folder sitting there on the white tablecloth, and something about it landed different than it ever had before. $4,300 for a table I'd just been told wasn't mine, in a restaurant that existed entirely because of money and risk that had come from me and nobody else. I opened the folder, looked at the number, closed it again, and slid it back across the table toward Ryan without a word, my eyes staying on him the whole time. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. Nothing came out. I turned and walked past the confused faces and the flickering candles, out through the private room, past the hostess stand, and out into the cold Pittsburgh night, leaving that folder sitting exactly where I'd left it. The drive home was quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. Not angry quiet, something deeper and stiller than that. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the dark with my hands steady on the wheel, replaying the whole thing over and over, the laughing Gordon Kavanagh's unreadable face, Nico setting that folder down without any idea what he was walking into. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Birch Hollow Road an hour later, something in me had gone completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes over. I sat out in the truck a long while before going in. I thought about Denise leaving all those years back, and how I'd never once let myself fall apart in front of Ryan, how I'd swallowed every hard thing quietly so he'd never have to carry any of it. I thought about remortgaging that exact house, about signing a $1.8 million personal guarantee at a bank downtown, while a loan officer half my age walked me through risks I already understood better than he did. I thought about being introduced as an old family friend at my own son's wedding. Around 11 that night, I called Walt Pruitt, an old friend from the rec league softball team, who also happened to be a business attorney with 30 years handling exactly this kind of thing. Walt picked up on the third ring, voice rough with sleep, asking what was wrong, because I never called that late unless something actually was. I told him I needed to come by his office first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull the paperwork on an LLC called Anvil and Oak Holdings, and that I needed to understand exactly what rights I still had as a 35% owner who'd just been treated like he owned nothing at all. Walt's office was in a converted row house over in Squirrel Hill, the kind of place with worn leather chairs and diplomas that had yellowed at the corners from hanging so long. I sat across from him the next morning while he spread the Anvil and Oak Holdings paperwork across his desk, the same documents I'd signed 8 years earlier without reading every line as close as I probably should have. Walt read through it slow, tapping certain pages, asking me exactly what had happened at that dinner, and I told him the whole thing without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 20 minutes in, tapping a clause in the operating agreement with the end of his pen. He told me my personal guarantee on that original loan wasn't permanent, that it was tied to an annual renewal the bank required because the collateral was my house, and that it came up for review again in 10 weeks. He said there was also a buy-sell clause that let me force a valuation and either buy out the other partner's share or sell mine, if certain conditions were met, including material misrepresentation of ownership to third parties, which sounded like exactly what had been going on with those magazine articles and everything else. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place. I told Walt I wanted to withdraw my personal guarantee formally, in writing, through the proper channels once the renewal came up. No shouting, no drama, just the plain mechanics of a man taking his name off something he never should have hidden behind in the first place. I also asked him to draft a letter invoking the buy-sell clause, giving Ryan 75 days to buy out my 35% at fair market value, or the whole ownership structure would go into public record through the standard filing process. Walt nodded and told me he'd have it ready within the week. For the first time since walking out of that restaurant, I felt something close to calm. The renewal letter went out from the bank right on schedule. 10 weeks later, Anvil and Oak Holdings was informed that the personal guarantee backing their original $1.8 million loan would not be renewed under the current terms, and that the business would need to secure new collateral or a new guarantor within 30 days to avoid the loan being called for immediate repayment. I found out later from Walt that Ryan's loan officer called him the very same afternoon that letter arrived, walking him through whose signature had actually been holding the whole structure up since day one. Ryan had never really looked closely at those original loan documents, not truly. He'd signed where Walt and I told him to sign back when he was 28 and desperate to open his first restaurant, trusting his father had handled the details the way I'd handled every detail of his life up to that point. Now, sitting across from a loan officer, explaining that the entire financial foundation of his 3 restaurants rested on his father's house and his father's credit, Ryan was hearing the true story of his own success for the first time, according to Walt, who'd gotten a call from the bank's legal department confirming they'd received our buy-sell letter that same week. Ryan went pale sitting in that meeting and asked to see the original documents pulled up on the screen. He sat there in silence for almost a full minute, staring at my signature on page after page, at the house on Birch Hollow Road listed as collateral, at the 35% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly under his father's name since before Anvil and Oak ever opened its doors. Whatever story he'd built about himself over the years, the self-made narrative he'd fed to reporters and in-laws alike, was sitting right there in black and white, coming apart in front of him. Ryan called me 11 times over the next 2 days, and I let every single one go to voicemail. Not out of spite. I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said standing in that restaurant doorway. On the 3rd day he showed up at the house unannounced, standing on the same porch where I'd stood so many times waiting for him to come home from school, except now the roles felt strange and turned around in a way neither of us was used to. He looked different than he had at that dinner, the polish worn thin, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in days. He said we needed to talk about the bank letter, about the buy-sell thing my lawyer had sent. I let him in, made 2 cups of coffee the same way I always had, and sat across from him at the same kitchen table where he'd once asked me to sign my life over to help him chase his dream. He asked why I was doing this now, after everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet and let things be however he needed them to be. I told him the truth, plain and steady, the way I'd learned to say hard things over a lifetime of not saying them soon enough. I told him I wasn't doing anything to him. I was just done doing something for him that he'd never once acknowledged, done being a silent partner in a life where I wasn't even allowed to sit at the table. I told him pulling my guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just me finally treating my own name in my own house the way he'd taught me he treated me, something to use quietly and keep out of sight when it was convenient. He sat there a long while without answering, staring down into his coffee, and for the first time in years I watched my son actually run out of words. Word travels fast in circles like the Kavanaghs. Within 2 weeks of that bank letter going out, Gordon Kavanagh had heard the whole story, not from me, but from his own attorney, who'd picked it up through mutual contacts in Pittsburgh's business community. Gordon called Ryan directly one evening and asked him point blank whether it was true that the entire Anvil and Oak empire had been built on his father's personal guarantee and a hidden ownership stake, the same father Ryan had introduced at his own wedding as nothing more than an old family friend. I heard about that conversation secondhand weeks later through Elise, who called me one afternoon, sounding shaken in a way I'd never heard from her before. She told me her father had always respected self-made success above almost anything else in this world, that it was the entire foundation of how the Kavanagh family measured a man's worth, and that finding out Ryan's success had actually been quietly financed and guaranteed by a father he'd erased from the public story had shifted something permanently in how Gordon saw his son-in-law. She said her father used the word disappointed, and in that family, apparently, that word carried more weight than anger ever could. Gordon Kavanagh, I came to learn, had built his own real estate empire up from nothing after his own father lost the family fortune back in the 80s, and the one thing he could not abide, above nearly any other flaw a man could carry, was dishonesty about money, a person who erases the people who actually made his success possible. Ryan had spent years building the image of exactly that kind of self-made man in front of exactly the kind of family that valued that story more than almost anything else, and now the whole foundation of that image had cracked wide open in front of the very people whose respect he'd been chasing the entire time. The Anvil and Oak location downtown, the same one where I'd been told I didn't belong at my own family's table, closed within 5 months, without my guarantee behind the loan, and without Ryan having built enough personal credit or savings of his own, after years of living like a man who assumed his father's name would quietly cover whatever gaps showed up. The bank called the loan when he couldn't secure new collateral in time. The Shadyside location followed 3 months after that. Only the original Lawrenceville spot survived, scaled way back, running on a skeleton staff. Elise didn't leave him, but something between them changed for good, the way she told it to me later. She said finding out the truth about the restaurants made her look back over their whole marriage differently, wondering what else Ryan had let her believe that wasn't quite the full story. Gordon, according to Elise, pulled back significantly from the informal introductions and social capital he used to hand Ryan freely, the kind of quiet advantages that come with marrying into a family like that, treating him now with a careful, watchful distance instead of the easy warmth he used to show. Ryan lost weight over those months. Showed up to what few family gatherings there were looking smaller somehow, the confidence that used to fill a room replaced by something more careful and uncertain. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, and I want to be honest about that, because I'd spent too many years loving that boy to feel good about any part of his life coming apart. But I also didn't step in to soften it, because for the first time in his adult life, Ryan was standing in front of consequences that belonged entirely to him, built out of choices he'd made without me standing quietly behind him covering the gaps. Ryan came back to Birch Hollow Road on a Sunday afternoon that fall, parking on the street instead of the driveway like he used to, knocking on the front door instead of just walking in the way he'd done his whole life growing up in that house. I opened the door and found him standing there in a plain jacket. No polish left in how he carried himself, just a tired man in his late 30s who looked, for the first time in a long while, like he actually wanted to say something true. We sat out on the back porch, where I used to watch him practice pitching into an old mattress leaned up against the fence, and he talked for almost an hour without me interrupting once. He told me he'd been ashamed of where we came from since he was a boy, ashamed of the truck and the work boots and the little house, and that shame had turned into something uglier over the years, a need to erase the parts of his story that felt too plain for the world he wanted to belong to. He said he understood now that erasing me from that story meant erasing the one person who'd ever shown up for him without conditions attached. And he said he was sorry in a way that didn't sound rehearsed or convenient, just plain and a little broken. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and that I believed him, but that things weren't going back to exactly how they'd been before that dinner. I told him if he wanted me in his life going forward, it would have to be as his father out loud in front of whoever happened to be sitting at the table, not as some quiet arrangement he pulled out when it was useful, and hid away when it wasn't. He nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he reached over and hugged me the way he used to as a kid, not performing anything for anybody, just two people sitting on a porch trying to find their way back to something honest. It's been almost a year now since that dinner at Anvil and Oak, and things look different than they used to, though not in the way the magazines would ever have written it. Ryan runs the one remaining location himself now, without my guarantee behind it, working the kind of long hours I used to work back when he was a kid watching me leave the house before sunrise. He calls most weeks now. Actually calls, not just when something's needed. Last month he introduced me to a new supplier at the restaurant as his dad. Plain and simple. No old family friend. No careful editing of the truth. Gordon Kavanagh and I have actually spoken a handful of times since everything settled, and I've found him to be a far more decent man than that first impression at the birthday dinner suggested. The kind of man who respects a person more once he understands what they actually built with their own two hands. He told me once, over coffee Ryan had arranged awkwardly between us, that he wished he'd known the real story years earlier, that a contractor who remortgaged his house for his son's dream deserved a great deal more respect at that table than most of the people who'd been laughing that night ever did. I still drive the same old truck. I still come home most days covered in dust from whatever job I'm working. But I sit at family tables now without wondering whether I actually belong there, because Ryan finally understands what it costs to build the life he has, and he's stopped pretending that cost might belong to him alone. Some nights I think back to standing in that restaurant doorway, hearing my own son tell me to wait outside, and I realize that moment didn't destroy anything that was actually worth keeping. It just finally showed me, clear as anything, exactly what needed to change, and gave me the push to go and change it.